Hey everybody, this is Tim Wolf. Today I'm talking about narcissistic personality disorder in musicians. And I've been playing in bands for some time, and I've had my share of experiences with narcissistic musicians. And I've talked to some of my friends, and they've had the same experiences, played in different bands, and had some different folks and some interesting stories. Who am I? I'm Tim Wolf. I'm a lifetime musician. I moved to Nashville a couple years ago to pursue my dream of being an artist and a songwriter, and that's what I've been doing. I'm here in my studio in Nashville, Wolf Creek Studios. I'd love for you to subscribe to my channel so that you can be alerted when new videos are put up. And also there's a link down below, a bit.ly link where you can find my music on Spotify. If you're curious about checking that out, that would be great, and I'd appreciate it very much. All right, today I'm going to talk about narcissistic personality disorder in musicians. And I'm not a doctor, so start off with that. I don't have medical training, but I can read an article and I can see that there are people that are behaving in a certain way. Here's an article from Psychology Today: How Narcissists and Gaslighters Emotionally Manipulate and Exploit Victims, 6 Common Traits of Narcissistic Gaslighters. So, number 1, frequent lies and exaggerations. That's a big one, and I have some stories that I'd like to tell you. Number 2, rarely admit flaws and are highly aggressive and criticized. Yeah, I'd say so. False image projection. Project a successful, powerful, envy-worthy, no matter how shaky your real life is. Idealized images of themselves to the world in order to hide their insecurities. Rule breaking and boundary violation. Number 4, example of narcissistic trespasses include cutting in line, chronic undertipping, personal space intrusion, borrowing items without returning, uses other properties without asking, disobeying traffic laws, breaking appointments, and negating promises. They violate social rules and norms. And one particular musician that I played with would be chronically late to rehearsals and gigs. And we'd call and his wife would say, yeah, he's here, but he hasn't left yet. It was just a chronic way of control and rule breaking. Number 5, emotional invalidation and coercion. I've seen a lot of brinkmanship in narcissists where they say it's either we do it this way or we're going to close the band or I'm not going to do that song, whatever it is. Those are the 5 things that are mentioned in this article. And also, I've noticed that in the musicians that I've worked with, they have wives. It's all been guys, and I'm sure there are narcissistic women. The experience I've had is with guys who are narcissists. They have wives who are really codependent in helping them continue their narcissistic behavior. Frequent lies and exaggerations. That's a big one for me. Now, I was raised, my father was the most honest man I've ever known. I mean, my father had a lot of faults, but I never knew him to say a lie. And his word was gold. Like I said, I'm not saying my father was perfect because he had a lot of faults, but honesty was one of his strong suits. So I grew up with that, and the fact that people would lie to you was something that I never really caught on to. And I've certainly caught on to it now, but I went through life for a long time pretty naive with how blatant people could lie. So I am a candidate for narcissistic behaviors. And I believe that what they do, because narcissists need a flow of attention and reaction to them, whether it's good or bad. I mean, they prefer good, but bad is good too. If they have that emotional reaction to them, that's like air to us. That's like blood to Dracula. It needs it to survive. A narcissist needs that emotion, that reaction, and either it's praise is what they prefer, but even if it's a negative reaction, it's something they need their fix. And they're really good at finding individuals who are susceptible to their wiles and are susceptible to believing their stories and giving them that emotional fix that they need. So let's talk about a bandmate I had. Let's call him Joe. And Joe was a drummer. One of the other characteristics that I read, by the way, and it's not listed in this particular article, but I also read that they have almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality. They can be very sweet and very kind, or they can also turn on you. So they have a side. They know how to act the part of being a very caring person, but they really don't have any actual empathy. That's something that is missing from their makeup, but they know how to act empathetic. They're really good at acting. So on the surface, and most of the time, he was a reasonable guy to get along with. And also apparently giving, because I stayed at his house. We would play gigs, and they would be close to his house, and I lived like 3 hours away, and he would put me up for the night. His wife would cook meals. So a very giving person on that regard. The things that he would do would, number one, he had a very grandiose stories about his previous work. Now, he grew up in Chicago, and he said he went to school with Dennis DeYoung and Tommy Shaw, two of the guys who started Styx, and he claimed that he knew them in high school. But his big claim was that he played blues with Coco Taylor. Now, Coco Taylor was a Chicago blues woman, probably the queen of the blues, and not really a well-known name. So narcissists are very smart on who they impersonate and what stories they project. This is a rabbit trail, but I read an article about a guy who would pretend that he was a pro hockey player. And hockey players aren't quite as visible as other individuals, so he could get away with it because they're wearing a lot of clothing and a lot of padding, and his body really didn't indicate that he was a pro athlete, but yet he would go into bars and tell people that he was a pro hockey player. So he was very smart in picking, like if he picked a basketball player or baseball player, and there's a lot of close-ups on their face, and they're much more popular sports, that would be harder to get away with. So Joe picked Coco Taylor, I believe, because she's probably not as well known as, say, as Etta James or some other female artist. So anyway, he claimed that he played with her when he was a teenager, but there were never any pictures. And then she died while I knew him, and she died in 2009, and we were playing in this band together, and he didn't even go back to the funeral. He claimed that he was so close to her, and he said, well, I went back a day before for only the close folks went, and I was part of the inner circle, so we had a special service just for us. The thing about narcissists is they can spin stories, even if you catch them in the lie, they can spin stories that even if you bring up actual incontrovertible evidence that they are lying, they will find a way to tell a story to get out of it. And as a last resort, they will blame it on you, saying that you are making too big of a deal out of this, and it's not a big deal. That's a narcissistic method of working. So anyway, he started by telling these stories. The bass player, it was a trio. The bass player did not believe his stories, would just shake his head, but didn't really pay any attention to it. I bid on hook, line, and sinker, and I think Joe knew that I was susceptible to that. So he continued to spin his yarns. Now, Joe Bonamassa is a big blues player, and so we played some Bonamassa tunes. Around that time when we were in that band, Bonamassa, his drummer, his long-term touring drummer, decided to retire from touring, and so Bonamassa was looking for a new drummer. This was common knowledge. Joe claimed that he knew Bonamassa, had dinner with him, and that he was auditioning for the drummer in Bonamassa's band. And he claimed that he flew out to L.A., and that he told this whole story, details about being in the studio and all of those sort of things. He claimed that he was one of the top 3 finalists to be able to be the drummer for Bonamassa. I'm like, really? Wow, that's exciting. What was that like? Well, of course, there were no selfies, there was no photos, there was no evidence. And then Bonamassa came to town in South Dakota. We all got tickets. It was a bunch of us. It was like 6 of us. I was like, man, maybe I'm going to meet Bonamassa because Joe knows him. And I lived about an hour and a half away from Sioux Falls where the concert was. The concert, I think, started around 8. And we were driving. Joe calls me and he says, where are you? The first thing he says, where are you? And I told him where I was, which was about 45 minutes away from Sioux Falls. And he said, I'm with Joe Bonamassa. I'm going to go to this bar, Latitude 44, which is a bar, or was a bar in Sioux Falls. I don't know if it's still there, where we had played as a band. Our band had played. We're going to go there and we're going to have a drink, and he's going to give some flowers to his girlfriend or something like that. And so I'm with 2 of the guys in the car, and we're like, holy crap, I can get to meet Joe Bonamassa. So I step on the accelerator, and I'm going like 95 miles an hour, just rushing. And I get there in about 35 minutes, and we walk into Latitude 44. It's just after 7. It's like 7:08 or something like that. And there's 2 people in the bar. There's the bartender behind the bar, and there's a bored waitress sitting on a table texting on her phone. And there's nobody there. And I walk in and I said, well, have there been some people here? And they said, nobody's been here. You're the first people to walk in the door. So I text Joe And he said, didn't get my text? And sure enough, there was a text that I didn't pay attention to because I was tearing through town to get there. And but like 10 minutes before, he said, well, we're leaving. So what he had done is when he asked me how far away I was, he was planning in his head, okay, he can't be here for so many minutes. I will claim to be here, and then I will text him and tell him that we're leaving before he could possibly get here. But he didn't plan on the fact that I would not look at my phone, which, I mean, when I'm going 95 miles an hour, I'm not going to be looking at my phone, and that I would show up there anyway, and that I would. So that was the first tip that I began to question. During the concert, then he says, he looks at his phone and he says, oh, I just got a text. They want me to backstage. And he leaves. I think it was a text from his wife. And he comes back and he says, they want me backstage, but he comes back a few minutes later. And after the concert, we're standing around and we're all waiting for him to say, hey, let's go backstage and meet Joe Bonamassa. Of course, it never happened. I mean, because all of this is in his head. And it took me a process to come to the point to realize how much this guy was lying. And here's the way I describe it. You know, people that go fishing will often say they caught a fish this big when the fish was only this big. But they caught a fish. What Joe does and what narcissists do is they say they went fishing, they caught a fish this big, but they didn't go fishing. They don't even have a fishing boat, and they don't even have a fishing license, and they don't even fish. That's the difference between slight exaggeration and just complete fabricating of a story. I was in another band with another friend of mine, a Christian band, and Joe was claiming to be a Christian. Maybe Christians can be narcissists, I guess, or narcissists can be Christians, or claim to be anyway. My friend Mike had indicated that one of his favorite guitar players was Steve Lukather from Toto. And so we're practicing, and Joe gets a phone call, again from his wife most likely, and he leaves and he comes back and he says, that was Steve Lukather from Toto. I met him when I was out auditioning for the gig with Bonamassa. We did some songs together, and they're going to put it on a record that I played drums on. And we're like, oh, you played with Steve Lukather? Wow, amazing, wow. As time went on, I'm getting suspicious, and I started checking things. And the date that he claimed that he went to LA, but the dates he was planning on going, that he said he was there, Bonamassa was in London rehearsing for a series of gigs, and Lukather was doing a 2-week gig in New York at the Blue Note. So physically, they were not even any remotely close to LA. Narcissists tell big lies, and they even almost like challenge you to even find where they're telling them is truth. So here he has this whole story that he auditioned for Bonamassa and he met Steve Lukather. Just complete, absolute fabricated BS to make himself look bigger and better. And he also had anger issues. He would try to control us with his brinkmanship. I was living 3 hours away. I would come to practices. We were supposed to practice at noon. He was the closest to the practice. He was probably 15 minutes away. And there were practices that he was 2.5 hours late. And I was angry and getting ready to leave. And the other band members like, oh, that's just Joe. And now I wouldn't put up with that. But that's controlling. That's part of the narcissistic control. It continued on, and I realized that he was a liar. There was a guy in Iowa who had been on The Voice, Casey. He was on Team Blake, but he got dropped out fairly early in the process. Anyway, he came back to Iowa, and now he's this kind of local celebrity, been on The Voice, and he was forming a band. And Joe somehow got into the point where he was the drummer for this band and the music director, and he was putting together, and he invited me to join the band. So, again, it's a 3-hour drive, but, I mean, to play with a guy who'd been on The Voice, it was a big deal. So I auditioned and apparently got the gig. But the other guitar player and the bass player were a little concerned that I was so far away because I wanted to get together in between practices. Viable complaint, and said that you did great on the audition, but your location could be an issue. So apparently that did become an issue. And see, Casey wasn't even involved in the selection of his band. He was letting his music director select everything. So I never even met Casey. Anyway, they had a gig then around Christmas time, and the harp player who was playing in the band, Glenn, a good friend of mine, they played that gig, and Glenn called me and he says, I thought you were in the band. How come you weren't at the gig? And I said, well, Joe had told me that the previous guitar player had decided to come back for one more gig, and then after that I would be in the band. And he said, no, there was a new guy there. and I don't remember the names, but he said, so-and-so, Bob, who was a previous guitar player, didn't play. There was a new guy, John, let's use those names, played. And so I called Joe and I said, what's the deal with these guitar players? And he said, no, Bob, there is a guitar player. He played. In fact, when I wrote the check out to him after the gig, I wrote the check out to Bob. And he says, and Glenn, who was in his 70s, he says, Glenn is going senile. He doesn't know what he's saying. So he makes up these stories and attacking other people to defend. And he says, I even wrote the check to him. And I get on Facebook, and because this Casey is a big deal, in locally, because he was on The Voice, he had posted pictures, and the guitar player on stage was definitely not the previous guy. So it was obvious that Joe was just completely lying when you could blatantly verify that these were just false facts that he was pushing. Finally realized something broke, and I said, there's no way I'll ever get him to admit to the fact that he is just outright lying in order to build himself up and make him look to be greater than he is. And he can't admit. I mean, he could have easily just told me, well, they decided to get a local guitar player. But he explained to say you're out of the band because of that. But he said, no, you're going to be in the band as soon as the next gig because the old guitar player is going to be gone. No, he could have just told me the truth. So he left a voicemail, which I didn't even listen to, and he called me again, left another voicemail, and I have not heard from him. And I just cannot have that in my life. And so that's my experience with that particular narcissist, making up grandiose stories of playing with Bonamassa and knowing Steve Lukather, and just lies that really don't need to be made up. And also the controlling issue, using anger during gigs to control, and has to be my way. I mean, today I would just walk out. And I did. There's a later story that I will tell in a later episode of another drummer who was narcissistic, not quite as bad as Joe, but had the anger issues and the controlling issues. That's my experience with narcissists. Frequent lies and exaggeration, 100%. And my tolerance to that today is almost zero. I will get out of a situation before dealing with that. So that's all I have today. Thank you so much for watching my video. Please go to the link down below in the description. There's a Bitly link. Listen to my music at Spotify. I appreciate it very much. It means a lot to an artist if you follow them. If you would be kind enough to like the video if you enjoyed it and share it with your friends. Finally, be sure to subscribe. And then also there are other videos on this screen that you can watch. And I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.